I don't think I've ever truly appreciated the undertaking it was to bring Pokémon to TV anime when production started in late 1996. Pokémon was less than a year old at this point, with Pokémon Red and Green versions releasing in February of that year. Following Red and Green, literally the day after, the first piece of Pokémon supplementary material was released, the original Koro Koro Pokémon manga, as a companion piece / bit of marketing. The one with the Clefairy is the main character you've heard about in YouTube videos. That is to say, there wasn't many incarnations of Pokémon to use as a reference or as an outline for the Pokémon anime. Complicating things further was that the two references that did exist often contradicted each other in the fundamental rules of the Pokémon world. This, along with the inherent representativeness of the original Red and Green, making a lot of it non-literal, more on that in my previous video, meant that every core aspect of the Pokémon anime would have to be built out from scratch for this more literal context. The intuitive, overarching question of what does the world of Pokémon look like in an anime is kind of a crazy and overwhelming one to even begin to consider in retrospect. What is Pokémon fundamentally about? Who is Pokémon about? People or Pokémon? What does the world of Pokémon look like? How do Pokémon live? What do they eat? Do they eat each other? Do normal animals exist in the Pokémon world? How do Pokémon and humans coexist in the same world? How do Pokémon and humans communicate? Can Pokémon talk? Are Pokémon friendly? Do Pokémon attack humans? Are Pokémon like pets? Do Pokémon fight each other in the wild? What do Pokémon battles look like? Again, looking to the games as a reference isn't much help for a lot of these questions. A lot of these questions aren't answered in the games literally. They are either gamified or possibly representative. Pokémon don't live in the wild in the games. They all exist invisible in tall grass, or caves, or bodies of water until they attack you and appear in a battle screen out of nowhere. This works for the games, but in an animated form. They have to be shown living in this world. Living, eating, sleeping. Things need to be made more literal, more real. And at the time there was no real reference for how that should look. It is a testament to how well I think the anime did that all these questions to us contemporaneously have defined answers. And we feel like we know exactly how a literalized Pokémon world functions. In a moment of arrogance, you might assume that these answers were easy to come by and obvious, as they are all you've ever known, as we do live in a post-Pokémon context. But that would be the blindness of hindsight and of what is. The answers to some of these questions were so unobvious, in fact, that some of the answers that seem franchise-defining in retrospect were almost not. Let's take, for example, the question, can Pokémon talk? At the beginning of production for the Pokémon anime, meetings were held with all the heavy hitters from Pokémon itself and the anime production, and there was a back and forth in one of these meetings on the answer to that very question. This actually makes a lot of sense, as the franchise, in the limited way it existed at the time, contradicted itself on this issue. In the original games, when Pokémon are sent out into battle, they let out a pixelated cry. And when you talk to one of them in the overworld, it seems like they say some iteration of their name as speech. In the Koro Koro manga, however, Clefairy apparently is a wisecracking jokester menace who speaks the same language as the human characters. Other Pokémon characters apparently could talk also. So, in half of Pokémon's pre-existing source material at the time, Pokémon could indeed talk. So the assumptive answer we all have of, no, of course Pokémon can't talk, was way more up in the air than you might think at that point, and therefore drew some deliberation. For the game, you also have to factor in the representative angle. Was it just the limitations of early video games as to why Pokémon cried when they were thrown into battle or fainted, rather than just repeating their names like they seem to do in the overworld? Are the cries just representative substitutes of the hardware limitations of the time, since Game Boy wasn't able to output recordings of each Pokémon saying its own name? Eventually, a deliberated decision was made. Pokémon could indeed talk like humans. The manga had won, and Pokémon lore was forever defined. Except it wasn't. And they eventually, as we all know, walked back Pokémon being able to talk, and the committee all agreed that Pokémon largely were like animals from the real world, and weren't able to talk human languages, but could understand basic orders from their trainers, etc. But even then, as we know, some Pokémon characters do talk in the anime, like Meowth or Mewtwo, along with a bunch of other important movie Pokémon throughout the years. Though these are more the exceptions to the rule, and the norm as we understand it today was solidified as we know it for not just the Pokémon anime, but the Pokémon world, but only after much consideration. Now imagine repeating this process for all those questions whose answers in the franchise were ambiguous at the time. It's an unenviable task to build out a fleshed out world that made sense for anime. The Pokémon world in the anime is seen by a lot of people as the default Pokémon world, and a lot of it had to be built out from scratch. They certainly borrowed a lot of crucial elements from the original games, like the classic monster designs, and the general outline for the world, and they borrowed the sense of humor perhaps from the manga. But the finer, more difficult details, like who the main characters are, what all these pieces look like together, and how a relatively realistic world would function in the Pokémon universe were mostly anime original ideas. And all these aspects are essential in Pokémon's global identity in its ubiquity today. I would say they knocked it out of the park, and made perhaps the most fantasized about fictional world to ever exist. All this considered, there's still a bit of uneasiness in the portrayal of some of these ideas in the early episodes of the Pokémon anime. The execution of the creation of this world was not flawless immediately. Some teething issues were inevitable. A notable example always brought up is the seeming existence of real-world animals in the Pokémon world early on. Pidgeotto is seen munching on a very nondescript real-world looking worm in a scene, and there's fish in aquarium tanks that Ash walks past in the Cerulean City gym. There's lesser examples of references to real-world animals more frequently too, like Ash's cow reference and Suit with his Caterpie pun in the Viridian Forest. Eventually this would be ironed out, and the Pokemon anime stops referencing or showing real-world animals rather quickly. And thereafter it would be an understood rule of the Pokemon world that real-life animals did not exist in this world. Though this is notably not only an issue with the anime, famously some of Raichu's Pokédex entries reference it being able to knock out Indian elephants with its power, which is odd. This was rather cleverly eventually retconned to it being able to knock out Copperjaws. Cute. So the teething issues were franchise-wide. There were other teething issues specific to the anime too, like with tone, or say the way the anime slowly iterates on how it wants to portray and deal with battles as a core aspect of the show, but we'll save that topic for a longer, fuller video coming soon. Ultimately bringing Pokemon to TV anime, and the daunting undertaking it was, I think for a lot of people is hard to appreciate in retrospect, because we live in a world where Pokemon has sort of always existed as it's existed, and it's hard to break out of that post-Pokemon context and appreciate that all this had to have been established at some point. And that some point was the Pokemon anime. Teething issues accounted for, what a commendable job they did. You will appreciate it, damn it!